Hi, welcome to Baking Nicky. I'm Nicky and I'm going to show you today how you can make your own croissants at home. And I wanted to make a new video. I actually already have a croissant video, but I decided to make this more beginner friendly. So I have loads of more instructions so that you're able to follow step by step. So let's get started. Croissant making can be your quarantine project because it's so satisfying in the end when you get that fresh homemade croissant. Who doesn't love a homemade croissant? Now this is going to be a 2-day process. We are dealing with a yeast dough. That means there's fermentation, resting times, etc. I've split up this video into a mini series of steps that you can follow, and hopefully it's a bit clearer. And for those of you who are more advanced, I also have a timestamp so that you can follow whichever step you're struggling with the most. Now this is a big project to tackle for the first time. You do need to prepare yourself and know what you're doing beforehand. I like to prepare a sketch and think about the steps before I actually execute them with the dough. So I thought I'd make a little bit of cutouts for you. Now a croissant is 2 components. We have the yeast dough and butter. Now, in order to get the butter into the dough and get those layers, we need to do what is called a lamination step. That means we take our butter and close it somehow with the dough and roll it, fold it, roll it, and so on and so forth. In this video, I will talk about the dough as a first step, the butter as a second step, the lamination process on the third step, the cutting and shaping as a fourth step, the proving on step number 5, and finally baking the croissants in step number 6. And before we start, here's a quick summary of the tools that you will need. Here I have lined up all my ingredients. Everything is cold. I took, for example, the milk right out of the fridge. And I'm going to combine milk and water. Add some salt. It's very important that you keep the salt away from the yeast. I'm adding some sugar and I'm going to cover this whole thing with my bread flour. I do like using bread flour because of the high protein content, which means that our croissants are going to have a very solid structure and they will rise up very nicely. Finally, I'm just crumbling up my fresh yeast on top of the flour. Take this to my mixer with a hook attachment and just set this on low speed for about 5 minutes until it's nice and combined. It should be forming a ball after this step. And then I set my mixer on a medium to low speed and beat it a bit longer for about 6 to 7 minutes. And the dough should be quite elastic. I'm just stretching it to see how far it goes, and that's good enough. It means we've worked it enough at this point. So this is ready to be chilled. I'm putting this in a Ziploc bag since it's a bit convenient for me to store away, and also it has a really good rectangular shape which will be kind of helpful in the rolling stages. So I'm just trying to shape this into a rectangle. It doesn't have to be perfect, it's just gonna make it easier when we roll it out. So at this point your dough is ready and it's gonna sit in your fridge overnight. In the meanwhile, we can prepare our butter layer. I have a 250 gram pack already here, and this butter has 82.5% of fat. I recommend that you use something with 82% or more if you can get your hands on that. This ensures that there's enough fat content in your croissants and there won't be any butter leakage. Now for 250 grams of butter, I recommend that you roll this into a 20 by 20 square. And I like to just have some parchment paper or wax paper and then cover this square with it. If you don't have a square like I do, like a template, you can just measure out your parchment with a ruler and just check that it's a 20 by 20 square, and you should be good to go. So instead of dumping the whole block into the square, I like to make it a bit flatter. So I do like to cut up my butter beforehand and just start lining it up on the parchment. And this makes it a bit easier to shape once I close the parchment paper. So don't worry if you didn't cover the whole square completely. We're gonna roll this even flatter. And for that, I'm gonna use a rolling pin just to make sure that I get into every single corner. And just start by rolling into every corner. I don't need to apply a lot of pressure. It's just happening very easily. And there we go. And at this point, you just put this back in your fridge and you can take it back out when you are ready to do the lamination step. The first step is to get your butter slab completely covered with dough without any excess hanging off of it. So we have to be a bit precise to do that. We have to roll our dough with respect to our butter slab. So in this recipe, what I recommend is to roll out your yeast dough into a 40 by 20 rectangle. And this will be perfect to cover a 20 by 20 square from our butter. Once we have those two components ready and rolled, we can do the book fold. And there we have it. We do a bit of pinching the dough so that everything is covered neatly. Obviously, because of how we constructed things, the size of this is 20 by 20, the same as the size of the butter. So at this point, we want to be quick and start rolling. And the usual guideline is to roll along the seam line. So we're gonna roll in this direction, okay? And we're gonna end up with another rectangular shape. This is a 60 by 20 centimeter rectangle. At this point, we have a nice single layer of butter. So what I'm gonna do is take a 20 by 20 square, fold it onto the dough once, and then the rest again. This is a triple layer fold. And we end up again with a 20 by 20 square. At this point, you've worked your dough way too much. We want the butter to stay cold and not shatter, so time to chill our dough. Once the dough has been resting in the freezer for about 30 minutes, we can take it out. And remember, this is where we ended our folding, so this is the seam. That means we have to roll now in this direction and again produce a 60 by 20 rectangle. At this point, our dough has 3 layers of butter by construction. So we're gonna take that, fold it again, producing the triple fold, the triple layer fold. So that means we're gonna have 3 times those 3 layers. So that's a total of 9 butter layers. Again, we're gonna take this to the fridge, come back, and repeat the process. And this is gonna give us 27 butter layers. In theory, if we're lucky. So it's day 2. We've prepared in day 1 our yeast dough and our butter square. So now it's time to combine the two and make those beautiful butter layers of a croissant. Now I'm gonna start off by rolling the yeast dough into a rectangle. And the dimensions that I will use for this recipe is a 20 by 40 rectangle. So I'm going to try to do that. And when you roll the dough out, it might get a little bit sticky, and it's okay to add a little bit of flour just to make sure it doesn't stick to your board. Just make sure that you don't overdo it and always remove any excess flour. I do like to check that the dough isn't sticking every once in a while, and I like to also make sure I roll from the middle upwards and from the middle downwards. and this is my 40 times 20 rectangle. Now it's time to add the butter. My butter has been sitting on my counter for about 10 minutes. I took it out of the fridge so that it gets a little bit pliable. You don't want this to be too hard, because then as soon as you start rolling, you risk that it might shatter and start breaking throughout the dough. And you don't want that. You want your dough and the butter to have a very similar consistency. So here we're going to do a book fold, which means we are covering half of the butter square with dough and then enclose the other half on top of it. And you need to get in there. I like to start pinching around to make sure that the butter is very neatly covered. I do that on the seam at the front and also on the sides. And that is a book fold. Now we want to start rolling the butter to produce our first layer, and we're gonna do that along the seam line. And for this rolling method, you want to do it in one direction only, and you want to produce a 60 by 20 rectangle. It shouldn't be thicker than 1 centimeter. As you're rolling, just make sure that you don't press too hard on the dough, just to ensure that the butter is intact. Once you've rolled this out to be 60 by 20, you can trim off the excess, which is uneven, and there you have your first butter layer. Now it's time to fold the dough. I'm going to take a third of the dough, fold it onto itself, and then the same for the other third. This will produce a triple layer fold. That means we'll have 3 layers of butter at this point. Now my butter is getting really soft, so it's time to chill this before we start rolling in the opposite direction. And I like to put this in the freezer for about 30 minutes. And we're going to repeat this step, rolling in the opposite direction. Again, don't forget where you finished enclosing the dough. That is the direction in which you need to roll this in. We're going to produce again a 60 by 20 rectangle, do the triple fold, chill, and repeat once again, and then we'll end up with 27 layers of butter. So once you finish the lamination, your dough should be in the fridge, and you can start thinking about cutting some nice triangles. A croissant is nothing but a triangle that is rolled onto itself, and that's the final form. So we need to get these. And the common guideline is to go for a triangle that has 10 centimeters in base and 28 centimeters in height. And also the thickness of a croissant, it's about 4 millimeters. So how does this translate into the dough that is sitting in the fridge? Well, we're going to take that out of the fridge and roll it into something that is 28 centimeters in height. Again, that height of the croissant. And hopefully you can roll it out in length to be 60 centimeters so that you get 12 croissants. Don't worry if you feel like you cannot roll it any thinner. This is why I said you might get 10, you might get 12, depending on the temperature in the room that you're working in and lots of other things. So try to go as far as 60 centimeters, but don't beat yourself up too much. The most important thing is to get those at least 28 centimeters for the base of the rectangle. And also you want your dough to be the right thickness, the thickness that is recommended for a croissant. Now, once we've rolled our dough and are happy with the dimensions, then we get our ruler and start measuring out the dough. Every 10 centimeters we do a mark. That is the base of our triangle, remember? Every 10 centimeters we make a cut in the dough. And then on the other side of your rectangle, we don't want to mark every 10 centimeters like here, starting from 0. We have to start from 5 to get the nice triangle edge. So we're gonna measure out 5 centimeters plus 10. This was gonna give us another croissant in the inverted direction. And then every 10 centimeters, we do a marking. Once you've done that, we are ready to cut those out and get our nice triangles. Again, at this point, put those triangles in the fridge. Do not let that dough get too warm. So after our last fold, our dough has been sitting in the freezer for 30 minutes and we're ready to roll it into its final shape. This recipe should give you about 10 to 12 croissants. This translates into us having to roll our dough into a rectangle again. And this rectangle has very specific measurements. We need to make sure that we have a 28 centimeter width rectangle and that the width is 4 millimeters. And this should hopefully give you a 60 by 28 rectangle, which you can then even out, trim off any excess that is uneven. And on one side, we make cuts every 10 centimeters. This is the base for a croissant. And in the opposite side, we cut in the middle of those 10 centimeters to produce the peak of a croissant triangle, as I'm showing you here. Don't worry if you don't quite get 12 croissants. Sometimes I get 10, sometimes I get 11. It really depends on the humidity and how hot it is in your kitchen. So again, we've rolled the dough quite a bit, so this needs to rest and be cold again. So I put this back in the freezer and then I'm ready to shape. Now this is completely optional, but I like to make a small incision at the bottom of the triangle just so that I can wrap my fingers and roll this evenly. It also means that at the very bottom of the croissant, you won't have as much dough and hopefully it will rise evenly and create a very nice internal texture. And there's our first croissant. Be very gentle as you're rolling. You don't want to squeeze too much or pull those layers too much. And I'm gonna eat 4 today, so these are ready to be proofed and they should really double in size basically. Ideally, we want to proof our croissants in a room that has about 25 Celsius in room temperature. But if you don't have that and your room is slightly colder, then you can put some hot water in the oven and check every 30 minutes to see if everything is around this temperature. If you go anywhere higher than 27 Celsius, you risk the butter spilling out of the croissant dough. How long you need to proof? Well, this ranges from 1 hour to 2 hours, but more on this later. And once you have finished your second fermentation, we're ready to do a quick egg wash. I have a whole egg here and I'm just gonna very, very gently brush this on top of the croissants. And you have to be very gentle because at this point the croissants have really expanded and you can easily tear the dough at this stage. So give yourself plenty of time. And I forgot to say that I shake my tray just to make sure that I get a nice wobble effect on the dough. And that's how you know that the fermentation has been completed and these are ready to be baked. And I'm gonna start with a really hot oven so that I get the overall volume that I want. I want them to expand quickly and then to form this very flaky crust exterior. And then I'm gonna lower the oven temperature to make sure everything is cooked through. Once I've taken them out of the oven, I like to let them cool for about 10 minutes before I actually cut into them. And being very gentle, I transfer them from the baking tray to a cooling rack. And here comes the big moment. First, let me show you the end product. Has very nice coloring. It's very golden brown and very, very crunchy and flaky. Now, for cutting a croissant, I recommend that you use a serrated knife, just to make sure you don't hurt any inner layers. Of course, you can just dig in with your hands if that's what you want. But for the crumb shot, I have to be very careful here. And you can see that the cross section is very round. This is thanks to the lamination done properly and the oven set to the right temperatures. We have this honeycomb structure in the crumb as well. It's extremely buttery and flaky, and once you dig into it, you can pull it apart and tell that it has all these butter layers just waiting to be eaten. I think I better start making my coffee now, don't you think? I hope this was useful, and if you like this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and also subscribe to my channel for more.